Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor in the Oval Office last week. The DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy.
The same old political playbook is back on the table, but this time it's getting a reality check. As Bernie Sanders doubles down on the tax the rich message, presenting it as a cure-all for economic imbalance, Bill Maher isn't buying it. Instead of applauding the slogan, he pulls it apart, questioning what it really delivers versus what it promises. It may sound powerful on stage and trend well online, but Maher zeroes in on the gaps that rarely get discussed. His perspective is blunt, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. If you're into commentary that challenges popular narratives instead of echoing them, stick around. There's more where this came from.
The American economy, to me, I know I've said this before, I still don't get it. Last week was tax day, and as usual, because HBO is so generous, and I'm sure so will be the new owners, I paid to the government, if you add in state tax, local sales, property, fees, Obamacare, probably almost 60% of what I earn. That's a lot, and I still wouldn't mind if Bernie Sanders would stop saying the rich don't pay taxes. And while I'm sure the super rich with their army of accountants and corporate loopholes get away with murder, us regular rich people pay a shit ton of taxes. And who stands up and gives us a pat on the back? Nobody, that's who.
Maher doesn't soften his approach and instead places himself directly in the middle of the debate. He says he earns around $10 million a year and uses his own situation as a real example rather than abstract argument. He breaks down how federal, state, sales, property, and healthcare costs combine to take nearly 60% of his income, leaving more than half gone before it fully reaches him. From that perspective, he challenges Bernie Sanders' claim that the wealthy still aren't paying enough, arguing that there must be a clear limit where fairness stops feeling balanced and starts feeling excessive.
The top 10% pay 72% of all federal income taxes, and the bottom half, 3%. The Democratic Socialists talk about socialism like we don't already have a lot. Social Security, unemployment, Medicare, nutritional assistance, Medicaid, Obamacare, disability, housing subsidies. Again, not against it, just the same question. How can you be soaking the rich and failing the poor so badly?
The debate escalates as Maher leans on large-scale figures to challenge the usual narrative. He highlights that top earners already shoulder the majority of federal income taxes, often estimated at around 70% or more. Meanwhile, Federal Reserve data shows the bottom half of households holding only a very small portion of total wealth, while U.S. Census Bureau figures continue to report millions living below the poverty line. That contrast creates a sharper question in his argument. If such a large share of income is already being collected from higher earners and redistributed, why hasn't it produced a clearer shift in outcomes for those still struggling?
So badly that on 60 Minutes last week, they were redoing the story they did 18 years ago about remote area medical. That is the program modeled after medical teams that drop into the poorest countries in the world for a few days to set up a tent where people with no access to health care can get some. And now we're one of those countries. Doctors within borders.
The pressure isn't limited to poverty alone. It's increasingly hitting the middle class that once formed the country's financial backbone. Rising living costs, stagnant wages, and constant economic strain are making it harder for working families to stay stable. The picture that emerges isn't of a system effortlessly supporting everyone, but of one showing visible stress from within. Organizations like Feeding America report growing demand, reflecting how even employed households are struggling to get by. At the same time, donations are tightening, charities are feeling the squeeze, and support systems are being stretched thinner. When a country considered the world's wealthiest starts showing this level of internal strain, it suggests a deeper structural issue, one that can't be explained by taxation debates alone.
Can it be that the federal government alone took in over $5 trillion in taxes last year, and we still need that? Are we really this incompetent and corrupt? Don't answer that. Whatever it is, somehow the ultra-rich keep getting ultra-richer, while a growing percentage is feeling truly desperate. You just wouldn't know it because everyone on TV is rich. Reality TV, rich women day drinking. Drama, rich women whose friend got murdered. Comedy, rich men shouting into cell phones.
Bill Maher's argument isn't new, as he has consistently pushed the idea that the real issue is not just taxation but government spending and efficiency. He points out that even with trillions collected in federal revenue each year, major problems like poverty, homelessness, and middle-class financial stress still persist. To support his point, he often refers to California, where despite high taxes and progressive policies, visible inequality and homelessness remain significant. For him, this contrast shows that higher taxation alone doesn't automatically translate into better outcomes, shifting the debate toward how effectively public money is actually used.
Dami seems like a nice guy, and I congratulate him on an extraordinary political achievement. But before the whole left side of the country catches socialism fever, let's listen to the other big winner in last Tuesday's election, Virginia Governor-elect Abigail Spanberger, who, before the 24 election, said things like, "If the party didn't shift to the center, we will get torn apart. And we need to never use the word socialist or socialism ever again." Well, she was right, but they didn't listen. Typical, am I right, ladies? One wing is saying don't ever use the word socialist again, and one is saying,
I am a democratic socialist.
Clear, huh? So how do we decide who's right?
This is where Bill Maher shifts from comedy into sharper political critique, treating the issue more as a warning than just opinion. He argues that messaging linked to democratic socialism is increasingly shaped by activist priorities rather than the everyday concerns of voters. In his view, workers, families, and small business owners are not seeking ideological debates but practical outcomes like stability and security. He believes this disconnect is pushing the Democratic Party further away from the people it needs to stay competitive. His solution is direct. Move back toward the political center and speak in a way that reflects real-life concerns. From his perspective, the middle ground wasn't lost by accident but gradually abandoned, and now it's responding by shifting in the opposite direction.
Democratic socialism is like a dating profile. Things look great until you meet up in the real world. For example, Bernie Sanders, his big thing was always bringing single-payer health care to our country of 340 million. But when liberal, tie-dyed Vermont tried to do it for a population of 626,000, it collapsed like that poor Oval Office last week. Bernie, AOC, Mandani are not Democrats. They'll be the first to tell you that. They're democratic socialists, and that's a very different thing, and I don't think people know that yet.
At the core of this argument is the gap between an emotionally appealing promise and the complexity of real-world outcomes. Socialism is often described in terms of fairness, equality, and shared prosperity, which gives it strong moral and emotional weight. However, critics point to historical examples such as the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Venezuela, where centralized systems have been associated with economic shortages, stagnation, and restrictions on freedom, while supporters argue that external pressures and sanctions also shaped those outcomes. This back and forth keeps the debate unresolved, because the idea of equality can feel compelling even when its practical results are heavily disputed. In Maher's framing, the concern is that when the promise becomes too attractive, it can discourage critical examination of how well the system actually performs in reality.
This is against why people sometimes, I think, question some of what you're saying. This is a survey student loan forgiveness recipients. 73% of applicants say they are likely to spend their extra money on non-essential, including vacations, smartphone, drugs, and alcohol. They admitted that to the pollster.
Who is this pollster?
NBC News. 52% they are very likely to buy new clothing. 46% they would use the money for vacation and eat out at restaurants.
Bill Maher also argues that part of the challenge is cultural, not just political, suggesting that many Americans naturally lean toward capitalism in practice rather than ideology. He points out that even policies like student debt forgiveness tend to produce reactions focused on personal advancement, such as investing, traveling, buying homes, or improving living standards, rather than shifting people toward collective economic thinking. In his view, that response reflects a broader mindset centered on ownership, progress, and upward mobility. He argues that most people ultimately prioritize building their own future over long-term dependency on systems, and if political messaging doesn't account for that, it risks drifting away from how people actually define success and opportunity.
I know the kids think that stuff that happened before their appearance on the planet didn't really happen, but it did. We've run this experiment many times, and the results are always obvious. Here's capitalist South Korea at night from space. Here's socialist North Korea. Yeah. In 1990, Venezuela was wealthier than Poland. But then Poland, finally free of Soviet-style economics, went all in on capitalism. And now their economy is as big as Japan. And people there have high wages, low inflation, cars, vacations.
This is where Bill Maher shifts the argument from theory into history, pointing to countries like Venezuela, Cuba, and the Soviet Union as examples of centralized systems struggling with shortages, inefficiency, and economic stagnation. He also contrasts North and South Korea as a striking visual example of how different systems can produce vastly different outcomes in living standards and development. His argument is that these results are not isolated incidents but repeating patterns across time and geography, suggesting deeper structural issues within the system itself. Critics counter that each case is shaped by unique factors such as sanctions, war, leadership, and historical context, making direct comparisons more complex. Still, Maher's core point is that when similar outcomes appear repeatedly, it raises serious questions about whether the system itself contributes to those results.
I don't think people realize we already have a lot of socialism. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, unemployment insurance, food stamps, veterans benefits, Pell Grants, COVID-era payments, farm subsidies, disability payments, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, corporate bailouts, and the jobs program that is building weapons the Pentagon doesn't even want. All that is socialism, much of it appropriate to soften the edges of capitalism, but the DSA are radicals about this concept, and radical economic policy is always ineluctably married to radical social policy. Their platform, for example, calls for completely open borders. They're for what Biden was doing, but more.
So that's Bill Maher's core argument, where he pushes back against the idea that higher taxes alone can solve deep economic issues. He points out that trillions are already collected through the system, yet problems like poverty, homelessness, and pressure on the middle class continue to exist. From his perspective, the issue is less about how much money is taken in and more about how effectively it is used and what real outcomes it produces. He also references the historical track record of socialist systems as a cautionary example, questioning the assumption that more redistribution automatically leads to better results. In his view, if the Democratic Party moves too far from everyday concerns, it risks losing touch with the voters it needs most in future elections. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Unfiltered Agenda for more unfiltered takes and real political breakdowns.